Okay, I wanted to get a lot up on the board because there is a lot of material to cover. I hope some of you are interested in this. I mean, finance can be a rather arcane subject. I remember, back in the 1990s, probably you're all too young to remember this, but there was a famous quote when Clinton was president in the United States. And, he came to office. He was the first Democrat to be elected in 12 years, so he's full of vim and vigor and idealism. A lot of his supporters, they wanted various new programs. There was talk of a tax on gasoline to reduce energy consumption. There was talk of a stimulus package. There was talk of education reforms, new foreign policy, this and that. Democrats being Democrats, they're generally the party. I think one person said they are the tax and spend party. The Republicans are the borrow and spend party. They both like to spend. The Democrats prefer to tax, the Republicans to borrow. But anyway, when Clinton, he kept being told again and again and again, look, we can't pay for that. You can't pay for that because the bond market won't like it. And Al Gore, this is actually before he was like the great patron saint of the global warming hoax. I mean the global warming movement, sorry. Anyway, before Al Gore was known as the great environmental guru, he was vice president. And he would attend these meetings too, and he finally said, look, everyone's always talking about not scaring the bond market. If I could be reincarnated, like in India you get reincarnated, as a cow or whatever, he says, I want to come back as the bond market, and then everyone will be frightened to death of me. It was kind of a funny quote. It came out in one of those political insider books, illustrating the disillusionment of the Democrats who realized they couldn't afford to pay for a lot of stuff they wanted to pay for. And oddly, as we know, the Clinton administration ended up being known for fiscal rectitude. Although, of course, Democrats like to say that's because Clinton was very disciplined about spending, and Republicans will tell you, well, no, actually Clinton came to office and wanted to spend lots of money, and Congress wouldn't let him because after 1994, Congress was controlled by Republicans. So one of the virtues of divided government, as Americans see it, is that if one branch of government can block the other branch, they can keep them from spending too much. Whereas if both branches are controlled by the same party, like they were in Bush's first 6 years or in the first 2 years of Obama, you tend to get mountains of red ink as the government just spends, spends, spends. Well, this is by way of saying that arcane as it might seem, public finance is really at the center of modern history. I mean, if you want to say the central question of modern history, whether it's the rise of Europe, but I mean even more than the rise of Europe, the question of why does the modern world speak English? Again, it's a basic fact of the modern world. It's basically because Britain mastered public finance earlier and more thoroughly than anyone else. Yes, they learned a lot of their techniques from the Dutch. But again, what does that mean, mastering public finance? I mean, what is the bond market after all? You can just call it this, the bond market. I mean, even the concept, when you really think about it, is kind of dramatic. I mean, after all, the Quran and the Bible, as we have said repeatedly, both prohibit usury, right? Lending at interest. Well, this is not just lending at interest. It's lending at interest and then speculating in the debt, right? Okay, and then you can take it even further, like what we had a couple years ago, this famous subprime mortgage meltdown, right? Where you had people speculating not only in government debt, but in the debt of home buyers. I mean, it got to the point it was crazy where a couple of years ago, people were buying $600,000 houses with no money down. They wouldn't even put any money down. A bank would give them $600,000, and then that bank would flip this loan and it would sell it to another bank, and maybe to an institutional shareholder, which was handling the retirement funds of people in Norway or something. I mean, yes, maybe that's taking it a little far. And as we all saw when banks abandoned their own standards regarding money down, meaning if someone does not have money that they can actually put down 20%, say, on a house, probably it's not very smart to loan them money. We can see here that loans and a market, although this wasn't a government bond market, this was like a housing bond market, actually brought down the global economy several years ago. That's how important this stuff is. In fact, whenever you watch these movies about Wall Street, in fact, I think Oliver Stone is coming out with a sequel to his first Wall Street movie, which came out in 1986. You always hear about stocks, right? Equities. speculating in stocks, taking over companies. Well, there's a kind of sexiness to the stock market, I guess. Stocks and bonds. Well, I don't know if it's really that sexy. Are stocks sexier than bonds? Well, whichever is sexier and more exciting. The fact is the bond market dwarfs the stock market. It always has. And particularly today, the bond market is enormous. I mean, if you think about what it means in today's economy. Okay, who borrows money? To a certain extent, everyone does. If you have a credit card, you're borrowing money. You're borrowing money, maybe you pay it off every month, but you're still borrowing it for the several weeks until you pay it off. Well, who else borrows money? Well, cities borrow money, right? Cities often spend money on things like road maintenance or repair that they don't always have the money, so they borrow money. That's called a bond. So you have municipal or city bonds. States, if you have a federal system, like in the United States or in Germany, say Bavaria or New York or California, they borrow money. I mean, California right now is basically bankrupt. It's a bad example, or maybe a good example. So states borrow money, right? Individuals borrow money. Companies borrow money, right? They issue bonds. So you've got bonds issued by companies. Obviously, governments, states, borrow colossal sums of money. I mean, the United States this year, there's this notion that people are talking about whether the economy is, quote, in recession or not, meaning is it growing or is it contracting? It's an absurd argument because even the people who claim that the economy grew partly last year say that maybe it grew 1 or 2%. Now, if you think about this really hard, size of the economy roughly $15 trillion. So 1% of that, who's good at mathematics? It's about $150 billion, right? So if the economy grew 1 or 2%, that means it grew by maybe $200 billion, maybe $300 billion. Well, that sounds like a lot. But how much did the United States borrow in that calendar year from basically the global bond market? Does anyone know? Let's say 2009, roughly. About $1.5 trillion. So let's say the economy grew by $150 billion. That's 1/10 the amount of money the United States borrowed in the global bond market. They have these auctions of things they call treasuries. Now, amazingly, people still buy this stuff because they think the U.S. government has a great reputation for fiscal rectitude. That is, it pays its bills. A little bit like on the individual level. These banks made mistakes by loaning money to people to buy houses who didn't even have enough money to make a down payment. That was obviously stupid. Now, loaning money to the United States today, the government, might frankly be just as stupid if you really look at the numbers. It wasn't always that way. In fact, the reason people still do it is because for the last 200 and, well, how many years now? 235 odd years that the United States has been a sovereign country, it has always paid its debts more or less on time. So that the reputation is still there. I mean, maybe the U.S. is living off of its old reputation. People still loan the U.S. money, even though U.S. government finances make no sense anymore. It's probably not going to happen forever, though. This is, whether the comparison is France in the 1780s or something like Russia in 1917, eventually the reckoning comes due. Eventually. We don't know when. But the interesting thing, again, is that if you look at all of this, you look at the size of the bond market, you look at its importance, it starts creeping up in all kinds of unexpected ways. So like if you look at modern history and you look at the rising fortunes of countries, you can actually look at something like bond yields. You can look at whether or not this country is paying lower or higher rates of interest. Now, I mean, the concept of a bond yield itself is actually pretty confusing. Have some of you had some economics in your classes? A yield? Bond yield. A yield is like how much it pays. Again, it's confusing because let's say you buy a government bond which yields 3% annually. It has a maturity date. It might be 15 years. It might be 30 years. But the basic thing is every year it's supposed to throw off an income of, say, 3%. Well, now here's the thing. You might decide, look, I don't want to wait 15 years or 30 years. And the beauty of the bond market, maybe you don't have to. Maybe you can just sell it to someone else. You've bought a share of the future income of that country. Now, that country is either doing well or it's not. It might be fighting a war. It might be winning. It might be losing. So let's say you're not sure the country's really going to win, or you just need money right away. You could sell this to someone, and then they get a share of the future income. That's when you get a market. That's what a market means. You can buy or sell these things to third parties. This is when the concept of yield becomes important. Because if a government, let's say, it's loaning money or it's borrowing money at 3%, but then people start to lose confidence in it. They don't think it's going to be able to pay them 3%. Well, then suddenly they don't want to hold that, because all it is a piece of paper, right? It's an IOU, so you might want to sell that. The trouble is you might have to sell it at a discount. So let's say you bought, $1,000 of this debt, yielding 3%. You want to sell it to someone else because you don't really believe it anymore, but that person believes it even less than you, and so they say, okay, I'm only going to pay $700. Okay, well, 3% of $1,000 is how much? Like $30, every year. Okay, so it's going to pay, it's going to pay $30, a year. That's 3% of 1,000. That is, its value is sort of like $1,030. Well, if now suddenly you bought it for $700, that's interesting, because the government still has to pay you the same amount. It still owes you $1,000 plus 3%, but you only paid $700 for it. So effectively, the government is now paying how much? 1,030 divided by 700. It's paying a lot more. That's a much higher yield. And if this starts to happen, well, what happens if the government wants to issue new bonds? Nobody's going to want to buy them at the old price. That's what happens in a market. You get possibly even a run on the market. That is, suddenly, no one wants to buy, and so the price has to keep dropping. And if that happens, then the government might find it can no longer find anyone to loan it money. That's what actually happened in France in 1788. We'll look much more closely at that next week with the French Revolution. Literally, the French government it was bankrupt. No one would loan it money at any price until it changed its governmental system. So that brings us back again to this notion of confidence. Remember how I said the United States is still able mysteriously to borrow money at a fairly low interest rate of 3 or 4%. I don't know why. Probably isn't going to last. If people start selling off these bonds because they no longer believe the U.S. government, suddenly the U.S. is not going to be able to borrow money at 3 or 4% anymore. It's going to go up to 5, maybe 6%, maybe 7%. Which, again, doesn't sound that dramatic. But if you actually look at expenditure, you look at, again, the question between Britain versus France, the 1780s, right before the French Revolution. They both have a roughly equivalent debt, somewhere around, if you compute it in British currency, around 220 million pounds sterling. The British, because they're only paying roughly 3%, they're only paying $7 million a year to service the debt. The French are paying about $14 million a year. So they're paying twice as much on the exact same debt. Now, if you look at U.S. government expenditures right now, again, you could reach a cycle very soon where the United States is paying as much as 20, 30, then 40, 50% of its income just to service the debt. Now, there's an interesting thing about that. I mean, if you're an investor in bonds, now, you may understand that just like we go through crises in our personal lives, we might have like a hospital bill or we get sick or something. I guess the equivalent of this with states is wars, right? States' wars are supposed to be unusual, right? They're expensive, right? So that, let's say, like after the first round of these wars with the Sun King, England had a debt. Way back then, it was only 36 million pounds sterling. Eventually, it gets up into the 200 millions. What's interesting about this is, at the time, people still were not entirely familiar with this whole business about, the bond market and debt and so on. So everyone was really concerned. They didn't say, hey, this is great, we owe a lot of money. They said, oh God, we're going broke, right? And in fact, the amount of money they owed was 7 times as much as the government raised every year via taxation. So everyone was kind of freaking out. So what did they do? Well, for a time, they retrenched. They signed a peace treaty, they didn't fight any wars for a little while, and they started paying down the debt, what we call paying down the principal. That is, you're not just making the interest payments, you're paying some of the original money that you owe. So they paid off about 6 million of the 36 million. Yes, eventually the debt started rising again, but temporarily it started going down because they were devoting 60% of their revenue just to debt service. Not something you want to do for the long run. But if you start doing it, you develop a reputation that you're going to do it, that's a good thing. At the time, they were paying about 6% interest. After another 20 or 30 years of relatively reasonable fiscal policies, they were paying much lower rates of interest. By the mid-century, they're paying about 3%. Now, how are they able to do that? I talk a little bit about institutions. I have a couple things up here on the board, the Wisselbank. I mean, this was, again, the Dutch, kind of the invention, the notion of a central bank. A central bank which issues paper notes, like many banks do, backed by usually specie or bullion, but a bank which also begins issuing these bonds, these kind of promissory notes saying, we're going to give you money to the government, and these bonds then basically make you pay the money back. You can sell them on a private market. Now, eventually you get a kind of virtuous cycle. Some of it has to do with politics. Remember, the Dutch and English team up. They're Protestant. They get a lot of Huguenot Protestant refugees from France who help enrich their economies. But some of it's also political. Going back to the English Civil War and all of that, when they bring in this new king, part of the deal is that he has to accept a limited role. He's still the sovereign. He's still king. But he has to accept that basically Parliament rules the land. That's true even in England today. Like if you watched that movie a couple of years ago, The Queen, did any of you see it, with Helen Mirren? It was about the whole craze about when Princess Diana died and all of this. They still have this tradition where the Prime Minister goes in and he kind of reports to the Queen. And he kind of tells her about politics and this is what's going on and yada, 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 and he takes the Queen's advice. Well, it's a ritual. The Queen has no actual power. The power basically is held by the Prime Minister. The power is held by Parliament. That's been true really since 1689. The king has a symbolic role, and every so often the king might give advice. But basically the deal is it's a kind of symbolic, or what we might call a constitutional monarchy, where the king does fulfill certain public functions, particularly regarding kind of the armed forces, as a symbol of the state. But basically Parliament rules the land. Okay, so not necessarily democracy per se. What it is a parliamentary system of government, which is to say you have a public body which is at least theoretically accountable to the public. Yes, the electorate was very small. The suffrage was limited, mostly to property owners. The House of Lords was, of course, only open to very high-born aristocrats. The House of Commons, even, most of the members of the House of Commons, even they called it common, most of them, too, were pretty well-born, or at the very least, they tended to be wealthy. All of that was true. However, it was still theoretically accountable to the public. The emergence of political parties like the Whigs plays something of a role here, partly in that what the Whig Party represented in its early days under Prime Minister Walpole, you don't need to remember his name, what it kind of represented was the merging between the aristocracy and the banking and merchant classes. So partly, some of it was through marriage. Aristocratic houses might replenish their sources by marrying into a banking family, that sort of thing. Basically, you got this kind of symbiosis. You have now a class of elites. Most of them are wealthy, yes. But on the other hand, not all of them are aristocrats, and virtually none of them, in fact, none of them are the king. So the debt is now held by the people. Okay, admittedly, not all of the people, but it's held by a lot of people. Now, this matters because, first of all, this whole business about how you can buy and sell these bonds, you can resell them to third parties. This allows a whole market to develop. There's demand. People want to hold the debt because they hear that you can make money holding the debt, which means people actually have an interest in loaning the government money. Obviously, this only works if they believe the government will pay it back, which is why it's important that they did start doing this. But it means that now Britain has sort of its own debt market. It doesn't have to go to Amsterdam, which was kind of the original banking center, or Antwerp, and borrow money there. This is a very important distinction. The French, even though they're a much richer country than England, they don't actually raise their own money. They have to go to other countries to borrow money. They never really do develop their own system of essentially government securities market. So in some ways, the Brits are loaning money to themselves. It's one of the reasons why people are so concerned in America. If the debt were held mostly by Americans, that'd be one thing. But the American public debt now is, of course, largely and famously held by international banking syndicates, and particularly by the Chinese government and by a number of banks in Japan. Mostly in Asia, although it's not mostly, it's maybe like 40% or something. Once you start depending on other outside parties to loan you money, you're somewhat vulnerable. The British are now raising their own money. People start following the bond market. People have an interest in the bond market. People have, again, a vested interest in investing in the bond market. So then if you actually look at the rise in the debt, and you look at this British wartime expenditure and revenue, I mean, what's amazing here, you compare this to the first chart, British population. Okay, so between, say, 1700 and 1750, the British population goes from about 9 million to 10.5 million. So it raised by about 1/6, which is what, about 15, 16, 17%. Okay, so there are more people in Britain. Income, however, goes up a lot. Income goes up by a factor of, whoa! It goes up, okay, these are slightly different periods, so you have to adjust. This is not annual, it's confusing. Income roughly triples, but meanwhile, the amount of loans they are able to raise, this goes up astronomically. If this goes up, you might call it geometrically. How's that possible? I mean, at the time, it really was kind of mysterious. It's not like people just suddenly understood it. There's a great quote here. Is Daniel Defoe, who's talking about this bond market. Remember that not everyone thinks this is a good thing. A lot of people think, oh my God, we're bankrupt, we're running out of money. But then people start to notice the money, it's sort of just materialized out of the air in a way, right? It's paper, it's IOUs, and yet somehow they're able to turn it into armies and navies, guns, armaments, the financing and the winning of wars. So anyway, this quote is kind of interesting because, again, it still appears very mysterious. Credit makes war and makes peace. It raises armies, it fits out navies, it fights battles, besieges towns. In a word, it is more justly called the sinews of war than the money itself. Credit makes the soldier fight without pay, at least without ordinary pay. The armies march without provisions that have to be paid for. It is an impregnable fortification. It makes pieces of paper pass as if they're money, that is, as if they're bullion or specie. It fills the exchequer and the banks with as many millions as it pleases upon demand. Well, it's not necessarily literally true what he said, but that's how it started to appear to people. It seemed almost unfair. How do the British make money out of thin air? How can they increase the amount of money that they spend on wars and equipping their armies by a factor of 10, by a factor of 20? How is it possible? Well, some of it does have to do with an increase in wealth and trade, like the French minister said. Yes, they are trading. They have profitable business, like the textile business in India. They have their own sugar colonies. That all helps. The increase in the national income helps. Tax revenues are rising too. Remember, that roughly triples. But credit goes up by a much larger factor. Well, how does it work? Again, I mean, the bill does come due eventually. But what it really comes down to, again, is reputation and belief in the future. It's kind of like not a self-fulfilling prophecy, a self-reinforcing process. Britain gets better at raising money, so it's able to raise and equip larger armies and navies. So it wins wars. So it's able to increase its share of trade revenue because it keeps, again, winning some of these trade routes from the Dutch or from the French, which convinces people that Britain has a bright future. And so people want to lend money to Britain because they think Britain will pay it back. And meanwhile, other countries don't do this. They're not able to do it for whatever reason. They either don't have the institutions, they don't have the confidence, they don't have a parliament which answers to the public. France, of course, being the most famous example. Well, just a little bit about the French system because it is so different. The French system, which seemed to everyone very impressive in the days of the Sun King when they were the greatest power in Europe, they did temporarily, under a few able kind of finance ministers, they did temporarily begin to raise a lot of revenue. But a lot of it was in this kind of short-term, short-sighted way. The most important way they raised revenue in terms of its long-term impact, it's usually referred to by this phrase venality, venal, a word which, summarized briefly, means the buying and selling, but particularly the sale of public offices, that is, government offices. If you wanted, let's say, prestige or a regular income, or if you were an aristocrat, who didn't have a lot to do with your time and you wanted some kind of a title, you could buy a position in the royal administration. Now, some of these are, really absurd-sounding things like, the person who was in charge of entertaining the king at Versailles, or, the person who was in charge of putting the king's, things in the king's room. Some of them were for things like royal pages, but mostly they were for offices which involved something like a tax concession. You could raise a certain tax in a certain place, so that you guaranteed yourself an income, which was great for you, but it was bad for the government, because the government had to pay your salary, and then they also had to sit and watch as you took basically like a percentage of the proceeds of the taxes you were collecting. The term you usually see to describe this whole process in France, although there are very complicated moving parts, was the notion of tax farmers, the fermiers généraux. These people who literally kind of farmed out taxes. The government farmed it out, that is, to other people. These people then could in turn farm it out to other people. A lot of people then, there were a lot of different kind of points along the chain. Everyone took their cut. There were other problems too. France had a lot of internal customs barriers, that is going from one province to another, you'd have to pay a tariff. There were other taxes that were just particularly inefficient or really stupid. The most hated of them was the gabelle, which was a salt tax. Which literally meant that everyone owed the government salt. It's very confusing and strange. Salt was, of course, extremely important at the time. I mean, the salt was mostly raised, just from the ocean, as it would dry out. But salt became a kind of important traded commodity, and the government would collect a certain amount of salt. There were other taxes. One of them was a labor tax. It's called a corvée, where literally they would just take people and force you to build roads and do things like that. Now, the odd thing is, if you added up all the taxes in France, they weren't necessarily that high. Yes, the aristocracy had certain privileges where they didn't have to pay them. That was a bad thing. The clergy gave what they called the people in the church. It was a voluntary donation to the government, meaning they didn't always give it. But the real problem was that the taxes were visible. You noticed them, whether it was the labor tax or this weird salt tax. There was a tithe you paid to the church. There would be special taxes in times of war. Most of them were direct taxes, that is, you paid them straight to the tax collector, even though the government would only see a percentage of the revenue. Again, this sounds like a kind of boring subject, but it's extremely important because economic historians have determined that the British actually paid higher taxes than the French did. But the British didn't have a revolution. Again, partly because their public finance was sound, but also because of this miracle. Not only do you have more public confidence in the bond market, but you had something which is called invisible tax. Excise. Taxes mostly on commodities, things like tobacco and alcohol. Kind of sin tax. It's a little bit like you have in Turkey today, where alcohol is, of course, famously expensive. Although tobacco is not as bad here as it is in other countries. Actually, I have a good example of this, like a tax you either notice or don't notice. I once heard a Turkish friend complain that the toll had gone up, on the Çevre yolu from Ankara to Istanbul. And I looked at him and I said, "Are you nuts? It went up from like 3 lira to 5 lira. Every time you fill your gas tank, you're paying 100 lira in tax, and you're complaining about paying 2 extra lira for a Çevre yolu, where you actually see where the money, goes." Anyway, he kind of took my point. He said, I guess I see your point. I'd rather it be lower, but on the other hand, you're right. I mean, the gasoline tax, that's the one that really kills you. But it's an invisible tax, right? You don't see it. I mean, it's true in the U.S. too. I mean, everywhere that has gasoline taxes, it's just rolled into the price of the commodity, right? Maybe you know it's there, but you don't really notice it. Or like beer. I mean, how much when you buy a bottle of Effis in the grocery store and it's now like 2 or 3 lira? I mean, frankly, that's amazing. Single bottle. How much of that is tax? I'm not actually sure. It's probably like 1 lira, maybe 1.5 lira tax, like 50%. It's a lot. The thing is, though, those taxes, you don't see them. They're invisible. And so even if they might actually be just as bad as another kind of a tax as far as how much you pay, you probably don't notice it. It's a little bit like the consumption tax value-added tax that they have in Europe. I mean, you have a version of it here too. Americans famously complain about their taxes all the time, and part of the reason is because they see them. They get these forms that say exactly how much the government takes from them. That's one of the reasons why we're always complaining about high taxes. Whereas in a lot of other countries, people don't complain much. Or they just sort of accept it. Maybe because you don't even see it. I mean, even here, the way salaries are doled out, you have to go ask for the tax information. They won't just tell it to you up front. You know, your mosh is kind of what you actually take. Which is kind of interesting, because from the government's perspective, that's actually brilliant. People don't know how much the government is taking from them. And in a way, that's what the British were doing. So the French have, in some ways, it's a little strange. They have the worst of all worlds. They're a rich country, but with a lot of very inefficient taxes, with a lot of corruption. They have all these offices they're selling. Again, it's a way of temporarily making money. Someone buys it, like someone buys into some government department. But then these offices then over the years end up costing the government lots and lots of money. Effectively, the interest rate on all of them is only maybe 3%, but then all of the indirect kind of corruption charges end up adding up. And some of them were actually hereditary, so they could be passed from one person to another. A lot of it was just frankly stupid, though, what the French government would do. At times, they would actually borrow money from these clever Swiss and Dutch, a little bit like how people kind of came up with these collateralized debt instruments in recent years. These sort of like brilliant but somewhat screwy ideas. The screwy idea of the time, it was called a lifetime annuity. Lifetime, meaning literally like the course of someone's life. So the French government would pay a certain agreed upon sum until a certain individual died. And so what you would try to do is find someone really young and really healthy, usually a woman, because female life expectancy is longer than men, you know, and you would then loan the French government money saying, well, you have to keep paying this sum back so long as this person is alive. It's very strange. I don't know why they did that. Some of these were paying as high as like 10, 11, 12%, these lifetime annuities. I mean, they were nuts. I mean, not all of the loans the French government had to pay back were quite that bad. I mean, some of them are more like in the 5 to 6% range. But the fact is they were vulnerable. And another reason they were vulnerable is because I talked about this. They weren't public or national debt. It was seen as royal. I mean, after all, the Sun King said, you know, the state, it is me. I am the state. We generally refer to this as absolutism. Now, one can exaggerate. I mean, in some ways, the power of modern dictators and governments is actually much greater than that of the Sun King, even at the height of his power. But theoretically, he was claiming that, you know, every avenue of government was responsive to him. He, of course, famously built the Palace of Versailles. Has anyone seen Versailles? You've been to Paris. I mean, it's huge. But the main idea behind Versailles was France had just had a kind of brief aristocratic uprising called the Fronde, and he wanted to keep the aristocrats close to him. He wanted everyone to be, you know, kind of like in his line of vision, so that he could control them, so that they owed whatever they had to him, so that the king gave out all favors and all patronage. And a big part of this, of course, was being able to spend money. The king would spend money on the kind of grandeur of the realm, or on various perks and privileges, banquets, parties, whatever have you, and everyone else would then depend on the king for his largesse. The king outfitted the armies fought in the name of the king. And so, okay, you can say, well, you know, that's great from the perspective of the king. You know, as Mel Brooks once said, it is good to be the king. But from the perspective of someone loaning money to this king, and you might not necessarily be as confident in his ability to repay. Now, okay, so long as the king wins wars and so on, you know, probably he's okay. But in the end, you'd probably rather loan money to a government which had some kind of a notion of both fiscal responsibility but also broadly shared sacrifice. A country where, again, the tax system seemed to be at least, you know, reasonably accepted by the public. France has all these kind of like warning signs by the 18th century. You've got a lot of corruption, you know, a lot of sale of government offices, a lot of people really with a vested interest not in loaning the government money, but rather in bilking the government of money. Taxes which are widely resented even if they aren't really that high. Taxes which don't make much sense. And you know, finally in the end, it depends on, to some extent, whether you win the wars or not. But even that is not necessarily true. I mean, the curious thing about the bond market, although it responds to things like whether governments win wars or not, at times even winning a war can be expensive. I mean, particularly when we looked at all these wars, now probably the most expensive, at least just in terms of like the rapid rise in the national debt, was the 7 Years' War. I think I had up here the one that ended in 1763. Yeah, the British debt more than doubled to 75 million pounds sterling. What's interesting here, though, is that that's pretty bad. It had been, remember, way back after the last round of wars, about 36 million. So it's more than doubled. The next round of wars, though, it triples. And this is kind of curious. Yes, it's expensive to win a war, but it's probably even more expensive to lose a war. Not just because you might actually lose something valuable, but this war, what was the big war between 1763 and 1783? The 7 Years' War was mostly between, on the one hand, Britain and Prussia, and on the other hand, France, Austria, Russia. But again, most of these wars are really, the essence of the conflict are Britain against France. What was the war fought between 1763 and 1783? Does anyone know? The major war. Well, you would if you were Americans. It's America's Revolutionary War, when America fought for its independence from Britain. But what was interesting about that is that in some ways that war, which we usually date from, say, 1775 to 81, that war was partly fought because of the expenses from the last war. So that even though Britain has sounder public finance, Britain has to pay off this debt. You remember how after the last round of wars I talked about how they start giving all this revenue to pay off the debts. They did the same thing after 1763, which was good. But to pay off that much revenue, they actually had to raise taxes. This is actually, it's very relevant today. Like, have any of you been following American politics this year? Not very closely. There's a big new thing. It's almost like a new political party, only it doesn't have like a central organized structure. The Democrats, like they always do, they're calling them a bunch of whatever, fascists or racists. But the people themselves don't see themselves that way. They call themselves the Tea Party. Tea, chai, right? And what they're referring to is actually what happened back in this period, the Boston Tea Party, when the colonists, protesting a new tax of sorts, dumped a bunch of tea into the Boston harbor. There was the stamp tax, basically all of these new taxes that Britain was imposing. Now, I mean, the curious thing is they were imposing them on everyone. It's not like they were just imposing them on the American colonists. Some of them hit the American colonists harder than the others. But the Americans, again, remember how I said Americans don't like taxes? This goes way, way, way back in our history. They were rebelling against these new taxes. And this eventually led to a colossally destructive war for Britain. It was almost like a civil war, basically, which Britain lost. Britain lost mostly because both France and also the Dutch sort of like came in and decided to support the American colonists. Americans don't like to remember that, but in fact the French did a very, they helped in very dramatic ways, not only financially but in terms of the Navy. They also sent a lot of arms to the Americans. So the curious thing is, like, the next round of wars, the Peace of Paris of 1783, this is when I said, remember, 1783, the debts of Britain and France are roughly the same. Now, you might think that since Britain has just lost this last war, that they would be the ones, have a crisis and trouble. But remember, they're paying only half as much in interest as the French are. The French also have spent almost as much as the British have on the American Revolutionary War. They've taken out hundreds of millions in new loans. The trouble is the French have no plan to pay them back. Britain not only will raise taxes if it needs to, Britain will, again, pay down the debt if it needs to. They will make strides to pay off the principal. What France does instead after 1783, France, the country of absolutism, royal prerogative, France instead raises expenditures and makes no effort to pay off the debt. I'll go into more detail next week when we look at the origins of the revolution. But it really is a fascinating story because in the end it ultimately comes down to finance. Yes, whether you win the war or not makes a difference, but it may not make as much of a difference as how you pay off the debt. Because although France won the most recent war, the War of the American Revolution, fought against England, France is the country which melts down in the late 1780s. You know, a story which could have a lot to tell us for our time, not because contemporary America is exactly the same as Ancien Regime France, but because what happens when a country can no longer raise money is incredibly dramatic and can lead very quickly to political complications no one foresaw. So I think we're out of time. What was I going to say? This Friday, I would like to do a small quiz. Now, for all of you who are here and who have been listening and taking notes, there's nothing to fear. In fact, my idea behind a quiz, it's not going to be particularly difficult. There will probably be even a few questions from today's class, since I know you were all here. It's not going to be an essay. I'm just going to give you a few key terms, or maybe a date. But again, major stuff that you definitely should know about from the readings or from the lectures. I'll probably give you maybe like 7 terms, and you don't have to answer all. You can cross off 2. Okay? The people who weren't here today are not going to find out about this until I send them an email late Thursday or early Friday morning. But since all of you are here today, I'm sure you'll go gossip with the others. But anyway, since all of you are here today, you have a head start. I definitely recommend, if you have not caught up with the Kennedy reading, please do so. At least read the Kissinger stuff, you know, about Richelieu and Ferdinand II, the stuff we talked about last week. But mostly I would focus on the Kennedy chapters we've read, probably the first 3 chapters. And again, don't be afraid. For those of you who have been coming to class, taking notes, listening, doing reading, this should be very easy. For anyone who has not been doing any of those things, I think it will be difficult. So, I don't mean to punish you, I mean to reward you. Okay, so this Friday, small quiz, okay?